Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. And today we are releasing the final Marquette University Law School poll of this election cycle. Joining me again today, as he always does, is Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Law School poll. And Charles, let's begin at the beginning by talking about when we were in the field, the composition of the sample, margin of error, that sort of thing.
Thanks, Mike. We interviewed October 21st through the 25th. That was Wednesday through Sunday nights. That overlaps with the presidential debate, by the way. We interviewed 806 registered voters with a margin of error of plus or minus 4.3 percentage points, and 749 likely voters with a margin of error of plus or minus 4.4. In the partisan makeup of the sample, it's close to our long-term average, 45% Republican, 44% Democratic, 9% independent. The long-term average is 45-45, so we're almost at that point.
Well, let's talk, Charles, about where we are in the presidential race as we head to the finish line here. What does our last poll show in terms of the race between the president, Donald Trump, and the former vice president, Joe Biden?
With likely voters, it's 48% for Biden, 43% for Trump, and 2% for Jorgensen. We still have 8% saying they'll not vote, or they're undecided, or they decline to say who they're voting for. This measure also includes people who initially said they were undecided, but when we asked if you had to choose today, how do you lean? And so the vote numbers we're showing today are those leaned vote numbers. However, it makes no difference in terms of the margin. So a 5-point lead for Biden. We had 5-point margin a month ago, 3 weeks ago, and we had a 4-point margin in early September. So as we've seen since May, this has been a very stable race. Since May, all of our results have been a 5-point Biden lead plus or minus 1. We've had a 4-point a couple of times, and we've had a 6-point once, but 5 is a really steady average across the 6 months since May.
Charles, we want to talk a little bit about something a little different for us in this survey, and that is this sort of a sensitivity to turnout. In other words, what would this look like if it was a high turnout election or a standard turnout or a lower turnout? Let's spend a little bit of time on that.
Yeah, one of the issues in every election is identifying who will actually go to the polls. This year, that's more complicated, or maybe less complicated, because so many people have already voted. When we're asking people about how likely they are to vote, we include, or have you already voted, either absentee or by early voting. So we do know who has voted already and how they voted, as well as the people that have not yet voted. In our sample of likely voters, about 40% or 41% have already voted. So that's about 60% or so who have not yet voted, but say they're sure they will vote. So those are sort of the most likely to vote people using our standard methodology. Sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead.
What we do see is it's a high level of professed turnout this year, higher than what we saw in 2016 and higher than what we saw in 2012. 2016 was below 2012, but this year is a little higher than either of them. And so to check the sensitivity of our results, we looked at 3 different versions of this. Our standard model, whose results I just gave you, but also one with extraordinarily high turnout. In effect, that's simply counting every registered voter as if they were going to vote. When we do that, the 5-point margin we see with likely voters becomes just a 4-point margin if everyone voted, 47-43 for Biden. But then we also looked at a lower turnout model. What if the extraordinarily high turnout we're seeing people say they will do actually doesn't reach those levels? And so we pull that down a little bit with a bit lower turnout In that case, it becomes a 3-point Biden lead, 48 to 45. So across these three variations, we go from as tight as 43 in the lowest turnout model to as high as 5 points with the likely voters, and all registered voters are in between at 4 points.
Charles, what about the undecideds, the people that 8% I think you referred to, who say they still have not decided who they're going to vote for on Election Day?
Right. Well, this is an interesting group. In 2016, we saw this group break heavily for Donald Trump at the end. This also includes the group of people, about 6 or 7%, who declined to say who they're voting for. So they may have decided, indeed, they may have already voted, but they prefer not to tell us. So what we did was create an allocated vote, looking at those people who were either undecided or declined to say. We looked to see how they feel about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. If they are favorable to Biden, but not favorable to Trump, we allocate them as a Biden voter. And if they're favorable to Trump, but not favorable to Biden, we allocate them as a Trump vote. Now, obviously, that's a guess on our part, but it's based in the feelings they express to both of those candidates. Also, if they say they're favorable to both or they're not favorable to both, then we just leave them alone and we continue to count them as undecided or declining to say. So when we allocate the vote, both candidates gain 2 points, but it doesn't change the margin. With the allocated vote, Biden is at 50% and Trump is at 45%. Jorgensen remains at 2%. And we're left with finally 2% that we were not able to allocate because of either liking both or disliking both candidates.
Is there any chance that some of those Trump supporters or Biden supporters who say they plan to vote for that guy could still change their mind?
I think there is a possibility of that, and it's one of the concerns in polling all the time, but especially in light of the 2016 experience. One of the questions from 2016 was that Republicans who were reluctant to vote for Trump, nevertheless, in the end, did so because it was impossible for them to see themselves voting for Clinton. That's a possibility this year as well. But when we ask, is your mind made up or is there a chance you might change it? 91% say their mind is made up. Just 6% say they might change. And among Biden supporters, 95% mind is made up. Among Trump supporters, 93% mind is made up. So there's maybe a little bit of room for that to move, but it's not a lot unless we just saw a wholesale shift. We're also seeing that in the voter loyalty, that Republicans are a little bit more likely to say they're voting for Biden. 7% of Republicans crossing over to vote for Biden, while among Democrats, it's 3% who are crossing over for Trump. And so there, too, you see a little bit of cross-party voting, but it's a little bit higher among Trump voters or Republicans, rather, than it is among Democratic voters.
How confident are Trump supporters that their candidate is going to win? And the same for Joe Biden. How confident are those Biden folks about their candidate's chances?
Yeah. So 39% of all respondents expect Trump to win. 46% expect Biden to win. 16 think Trump will win by a lot, and 23% say he'll win by a little bit. 29% say Biden by a little, and 17% Biden by a lot. So you can see that a lot of folks think this will be a fairly close race, and the endpoints are kind of limited. But interestingly, 80% of Trump voters expect him to win, and 80% of Biden voters expect him to win. So there's a pretty strong partisan filter of thinking your guy's going to win in the end.
During his campaign, the president has raised a number of questions about the integrity of the vote. Can we really believe the vote? We asked people, how confident are you that ballots will be accurately cast and counted? What did we find there?
So fair levels of confidence. 27% are very confident that the ballots will be counted fairly or accurately. 43% somewhat confident. 21 not too confident, and only 7 not at all confident. But as you say, President Trump has questioned whether that count will be accurate. So among Republicans, 61% are very or somewhat confident, but that's 82% among Democrats. So there is a greater deal of misgivings among Republicans, the 37% who are not very confident or not at all confident. And that's smaller, only 18% of Democrats have those doubts.
I want to go back to something that I think you mentioned right at the beginning, Charles, and that's the percentage that we see in our poll of people who have already voted. Let's go over that again. The state obviously issues numbers on an almost daily basis. What do we know about how many people who've already voted?
Right. Well, as of the conclusion of our survey, so that was as of Sunday night, the other day, 41% of our respondents said they had already voted either absentee or in person. Monday morning at 7:30, the State Elections Commission said that 37.5% of registered voters had cast their ballot. So we're pretty close to that. It's also possible that some of our people said they had voted, but their ballots were in the mail and had not yet been counted by the election officials. So I think we're pretty close to where the state has this number. I think it's possible we will get to 50% voting early by election day. The numbers have been rising as early voting is taking place in the state. But that's quite an upturn from what we're used to in 2016 or 2012 or before.
Current thinking is that Democrats are going to do better in early voting. It's something that the Democratic Party, Democratic candidates have strongly encouraged. Do we see that reflected in our poll results?
We certainly do. Of people who say they've already voted, 64% say they voted for Biden, 25% for Trump, 2% for Jorgensen, and as I mentioned earlier, about 9% declined to say how they voted. But among likely voters who've not yet voted, 35% for Biden, 56% for Trump, 3% for Jorgensen. And again, some of those likely voters who haven't voted yet will go on to vote early or possibly still submit an absentee ballot. But at this stage, I expect most of them will, in fact, vote on Election Day.
In our polls, often, Charles, we ask about certain candidate qualities. And one of those qualities is whether or not Joe Biden or Donald Trump cares about people like you, like me, like everyone else. Let's start with Trump. Do people feel that he cares about people like them?
Yeah, and let me say that we asked this question in part because it's a standard survey question. This sense of empathy of the candidate for the public is a common theme. But I think it's more important this year in that in 2016 and since, there's been a lot of argument that Donald Trump showed that he paid attention to and cared about people who felt like they had been ignored by the political system for a long time. And so his concern for them was an element of his campaign and of the coverage of it. Likewise, this year, Joe Biden is stressing that he cares about you, the average American, all Americans, as he said the other night. And so I think this is something that both candidates have based part of their appeal on in terms of reaching out to otherwise ignored voters. That message is less convincing to people for Donald Trump. 43% said cares about people like me describes Trump, but 54% said it does not describe Donald Trump. With Joe Biden, though, it's a solid 56% say he cares about people like them. 40% say that does not describe him. So Biden, with a fairly clear lead on this. Also, the Biden lead on it has expanded from 3 weeks ago when it was 48% cares, 45% does not care for Biden. So this is one of the changes we've seen over the last 3 weeks in which Biden has taken a step in a more positive direction, whereas other things, a couple have moved in Trump's direction, and others haven't changed much at all. But on this one, Biden does seem to have a bit of an uptick this time.
Throughout his tenure in office, we've asked people whether they have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of Donald Trump. As we sit here just a few days away from the election, how do Wisconsin voters feel about the president?
And here there are two things. President Trump has had a net negative favorability rating in our data since he took office and before he took office. That improved to become less negative once he was elected and became president, but it has stayed a bit negative. In this latest survey, 44% have a favorable view of him and 54% an unfavorable. That's barely changed. 3 weeks ago, it was 42-52. And 3 weeks before that, it was 42-54. So a lot of stability in his evaluations. With Biden, though, there has been a upward movement in his favorability throughout the year, and that includes recently. In this latest poll, 49% are favorable, 46% unfavorable, a net 3-point favorable. And that's the same net. It was 48-45 last month or early this month. And finally, that's up from a 45-47, a little bit negative in early September. And if we go further back in the year, he had been net negative really since August of 2019, but since March has been moving in a more net favorable direction. And as you see in the last couple of polls, has for the first time reached net positive territory.
And before we talk about Mike Pence and Kamala Harris, again, help us remember, Charles, Hillary Clinton at this stage of the campaign in 2016 was still underwater in terms of favorability ratings, was she not?
She was considerably net negative late in the campaign. Typically, she was between -10 and -15 or so, about where Donald Trump is right now. But also remember, this isn't everything. Donald Trump was even more net negative before the 2016 election, and he won here in the state. And so while favorability is an important indicator, the case of Trump and Clinton shows that if both candidates are net negative as they were then, the one that's more net negative can still go ahead to win.
Let's talk about Vice President Pence and the Democratic vice presidential nominee, Kamala Harris. How did they fare in this favorability, unfavorable rating?
They're more balanced than the presidential candidates, though they also are less familiar to voters. About 10% say they are not able to give a rating to Pence, and about 13% not able to rate Harris. So a little bit more uncertainty about them, though that's typical for vice presidential candidates. For Pence, his favorability rating is 44 favorable, 45 unfavorable. And for Harris, 45 favorable, 41 unfavorable. So they're both close to even. Pence a -1 and Harris a +4, but close to dead even.
And so what were Donald Trump's job approval numbers, his final job approval numbers, Charles, is before the election? And maybe contrast that with how he has performed throughout the year.
Excuse me. These job approval numbers are measures that we track in every poll because they're summaries of how the president is handling his job or how he's handling particular issues like the coronavirus. And we ask them, do you approve or disapprove of the job he's doing in this area or overall? Because we want a summary that boils it all down into a single evaluation. So, there are so many aspects of the presidency. You could ask a extraordinarily long series of questions about each policy area, but these are ultimately the things that boil it down to the few most prominent issues or crises of the moment. With President Trump's handling of the presidency overall, his numbers have been quite stable throughout his presidency. He has smaller variation in approval than Obama before him in the Marquette polling. And if we look at Gallup polling, Trump has the smallest variation in approval of any president going all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt. And that in part reflects how polarized we are as a society in terms of Republicans giving him very high ratings regardless of what happens, Democrats giving him very low ratings regardless. And as a result, there's not much movement. Here in Wisconsin, his approval has ranged from a low of 41 to a high of 48. And this month, we see him ticking up near his high range to 47% approve, just 1 point below his all-time high of 48. And that's a 3-point uptick from the 44% approval at the beginning of October, 3 weeks ago. That's under normal circumstances, we just say that's within the range of margin of error, and it is. On the other hand, his job approval numbers have been so steady for so long, it is notable that it's ticked up 3 points towards his high range. At the same time, though, his disapproval rating did not move. 52% disapprove, exactly the same as last survey.
The president has faced a number of significant challenges, and the first one we'll talk about is the coronavirus pandemic. This has been a problem area for the president, frankly, and in the polling that we've seen for some time in the state of Wisconsin. Is it again in this poll?
Yes, it has been an issue, one of his weak areas, and it continues to be, and in fact ticked down a little bit, a little worse. This month, 40% approve of the job he's done handling the virus, 58 disapprove. Again, that's only a little different. It was 41 to 56 at the beginning of the month. This has trended down since the virus outbreak occurred. Back in late March, he had a 51 approve, 46 disapprove rating, and that's worked its way down over the spring and summer. Since early September, it's been 41, 41, and 40, so very little movement, and it was at 40% in early August. So 40 is an all-time low, but it ties the low that he hit in early August on this as well.
How about the president's handling of the protests that followed the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis? How do people think he's doing in terms of handling that?
Yes, this is an area where we've seen a little gradual upturn in his approval rating. In June, when the protests first started, his approval was just 30%, with 58% disapprove, but 11% saying they didn't have an opinion. That has worked its way up in approval to this month, reaching 40% approve, 54% disapprove, and we're down to 6% that don't have an opinion. So still a net negative by 14 points, but this had been his weakest area, whereas now coronavirus is his weakest area with a net negative of 18. And so as the virus has spread and the issues of the virus remain, we have seen that become more negative, while the protests, which are viewed as a weak area of his performance, nevertheless have become a little bit less negative over the course of the summer and now fall.
You mentioned his weakest issues. Let's talk for a moment about his strongest issue. And this has been consistent now. It has happened in basically every poll we've had for the last few months. It's the economy, correct?
It is. And this has been his strong suit since he took office. Every time we've asked about it, he's been net positive on the economy. This month, it's 51% approve of his handling of the economy, 48% disapprove. That 51 is the same as 3 weeks ago, but it is a 3-point uptick in disapproval of handling the economy. Still a net positive, and of all the ones we've measured, the one in which he gets a net positive rating. And while his approval rating on the economy was a little bit better in January, February, before the pandemic and the economic consequences of it. He has not fallen below 50% in our readings on this. So it does clearly remain the area that he's strongest in terms of people's perception of his handling of his job.
Charles, let's spend a moment or two on something that we noticed in this poll, and that people who read the poll results will notice. I guess it's safe to say that anytime you go into the field and you do a poll, there can always be a surprise. And so let's talk about something of a surprise that we found in this poll, and what we're supposed to make of that.
Sure. This is for the folks that go in and look at the crosstabs every month, and we're glad you do, and we make those crosstabs available for exactly that reason. However, this month we have an anomalously more Republican than usual group of 18 to 29-year-olds. So we thought it was important to alert people to that and present the results so that it's not a surprise when you reach this in the crosstabs. 18 to 29-year-olds have been a solid pro-Biden and leaning Democratic group. But in this month's survey, they're going 48% for Biden, but 45% for Trump. So just a 3-point margin. That's a far narrower margin than we've seen in recent months at all with this group. The reason for this is probably just random noise. There are only about 60 respondents who fall into this group, this age group, and that has a margin of error because it's a very small sample of plus or minus 15 percentage points or more. So while this is a lot of variation from what we normally see, it's not that unusual to see a small group bounce around. I would personally have preferred that they bounce around earlier in the year rather than in the last poll before the election. And this is in the press release if people want to see it. When we combine the last 3 polls with 18 to 29-year-olds, Biden is at 54, Trump 34, a 20-point Biden margin. And that seems more realistic in light of the polling of this age group since May, rather than this very narrow margin in the latest poll. So I think the latest poll has an anomalously Republican group of this age category. And there's nothing that we did differently in trying to reach these folks. But this week, or this poll, we had a Republican tilt to the group. And so we leave it to you to make what you will. I will say that while it's quite different from its long-term average for 18 to 29-year-olds, it does not affect the overall results of the survey very much. If we statistically force the age groups to be exactly their long-term partisanship, then it raises the Biden margin by 1 percentage point from a 5-point lead to a 6-point lead. And so that's a very modest change, but it also would require us to adjust the partisanship of other age groups as well. And we don't prefer to do that. So it's something to be aware of. It has a very modest effect on the overall results.
Let's talk about COVID for a couple of moments, Charles. It seems especially appropriate. And frankly, we've been asking a fair number of questions about COVID since the pandemic first began really in this country back in March, at least in a meaningful way. Let's talk about how people feel about this, how concerned they are about getting this virus. And we asked this question at a time, as anybody who follows the state of Wisconsin knows, we are in the midst of a spike in cases in this state. So that's the framework for the question. How do people feel about their chances of getting this virus?
Yeah, and 22% say they're very worried about getting it. Another 35% somewhat worried. Then 20% not very worried, and 19% not at all worried. However, the percentage very worried is actually down a little bit from 3 weeks ago, despite the increase in cases and deaths that we've seen over the last month. That increase had begun the previous month. In September, we started rising on September 4th, and we've risen steadily since. Our early October poll showed an upturn from 21 to 27% very worried. But now this month, that dips back down to 22, despite the fact that cases and deaths have continued to rise. I have no good explanation for that. Earlier in the year, it seemed that worry rose when cases were rising, but then fell off when cases were declining. So this month is out of line with that. What has not changed, though, is the stable approximately 20% who consistently say they're not at all worried about the virus. And on that measure, since the spring, we've been very close to 20% not at all concerned in every poll. And so this also represents a little bit of the division within the state of a sizable 1 in 5 that really think that this is not something for them to worry about. And at the opposite end, a very worried group that's fluctuated up and down. And as I say, mostly has moved with the case count, but this month moved the opposite way.
This difference of opinion is also reflected in mask wearing. And so we asked people, do you wear a mask when you go out in public? What did they tell us?
Yeah, in last month's poll, we asked, do you approve or disapprove of requiring masks in public? And 72% said they approve. So this time we were curious whether people's behaviors matched up very well with what they said they approved of as public policy. And we find a little bit lower number. 64% say they always wear a mask when they're out in public. Another 20% say they wear it most of the time. But 12% say they only wear a mask now and then, and 3% say they never wear a mask in public. If you look at that 3% never and maybe add the 12% only now and then, that's still less than the about 20% who say they're not at all worried about getting the virus. So I think maybe we could take away from that mask compliance, at least self-professed mask compliance, actually runs a little bit higher than we might expect, just given the percentage of people who say they're not at all worried about getting the virus.
In past polls, we've asked about a number of activities that I guess you might say would define a little bit more normal times. Would you go to a sporting event with lots of fans in the stands? Would you go to a restaurant? Things like that. We asked the restaurant question again. How comfortable would you be going to a restaurant? What did we find this time, Charles?
We picked this one both because I would love to go back out to restaurants, a little self-interest in this, but also because it falls in the middle. We had found in earlier surveys that very large percentages, 80% or so, were comfortable visiting a family or a friend in their homes, but were very uncomfortable with mass sporting events like a football game. So going to restaurants fell in between these two extremes. So we thought it'd be an interesting indicator for that reason. This month, 52% say they're comfortable eating inside at a restaurant, and 47% are uncomfortable. And this is a shift over the long haul. In May, 42% were comfortable, but 57% were uncomfortable, just about a little more than the polar opposite of this month. And in June, we were right in between, 49 comfortable, 49 uncomfortable. So I think this is a good indication of an evolution in the public's thinking. It's not a radical reversal. There's still sizable percentages, both comfortable and uncomfortable. But it does show that there has been a drift over the summer, spring and summer, to being a bit more comfortable with doing these activities that at the beginning of the epidemic, we were more skittish about doing.
Back in the spring, Charles, a decision was made in an attempt to combat the virus and minimize its spread. A decision was made to close schools, businesses, restrict public gatherings. With the benefit of hindsight, here we are in October. How do people feel about that today? Was that the right decision, or was it something that was kind of an overreach?
Yeah, we had asked about this as early as March. This month, 68%, looking back on it, we're specifically asking, do you think the decision to close schools and businesses in the last spring was an appropriate response or an overreaction? This month, 68% say it was appropriate, 26% say it was an overreaction. That's a shift from March when it was 86 appropriate, 10 an overreaction. Now, that was at the height of the outbreak just before the April election. There was a lot going on, and the safer at home order was new. In May, after we had had a little bit more time, it was 69% appropriate, 26% overreaction. So by that standard, this month has hardly changed at all at 68, 26. I thought this was interesting because with hindsight, we might reevaluate actions that were taken, and appropriately so in the light of events over time. But this is one where there's been very little change, at least since May, even if May was a little less supportive than it had been in March.
A couple of questions about the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think they reflect the highly partisan times that we live in, Charles. The first question involves the nomination of now confirmed Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Tell us what we asked and how people felt about her confirmation.
Earlier, we had asked whether the Senate should hold a vote, but this time we asked, if you were a senator, would you vote to confirm her or to reject her? 48% said they would vote to confirm. 38% said they would vote against her confirmation, and the remainder were undecided or didn't know. This is a sharply partisan issue, unsurprisingly. Among Republicans, 87% support her nomination or said they would vote for her. 75% of Democrats said they would vote against her. Among independents, 38 support, 28% oppose, but a very substantial 33% of independents say they don't know. And that reflects the fact that partisans are more interested in the court, think this is a bigger issue. Independents are less engaged by the court, and that shows up in 1 in 3 independents lacking an opinion about her appointment.
In just a matter of days, November 10th, I think, the Supreme Court is scheduled to hear oral arguments in a case that would essentially challenge the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, Charles. We asked people whether or not they think the court should decide to declare it unconstitutional, or at least parts of it unconstitutional. What did we find?
Yeah, and to be clear, we asked, would you favor or oppose the Supreme Court declaring the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional? For those into the constitutional law issues, there are many things the court could decide short of striking down the entire law. But as the political debate has unfolded, it has certainly focused more on striking the entire law. And President Trump's Justice Department has argued before the court, or will be arguing before the court, for the complete unconstitutionality of the law. They favor the complete striking down of the law. So this, and Democrats certainly hold this up in their counter arguments. The public has shifted on the Affordable Care Act. It was more unpopular than popular for years in our data as well as in national data. But since 2017, it has become more popular than unpopular, and that holds up in our data. 35% would favor the court striking down the Affordable Care Act, but 55% would oppose the court doing that. There's also a partisan gap, but it's actually a little narrower gap than it is with Coney Barrett, in that among Republicans, 67% favor striking down the law, but 20% oppose and 12% say they don't know. So that's a 2-to-1 majority of Republicans, but it's not a 8 or 9-to-1 majority as we saw Republicans supporting Coney Barrett's nomination to the court. Among Democrats, though, it's more unanimous, or nearly so. 89% of Democrats oppose striking the law, 6% favor, and 4 don't have an opinion. And independents are interesting because they're really pretty lopsided on this. Just 17% of independents favor striking down the Affordable Care Act, 69% oppose, and 14% say they don't know. So this, I do think, represents an enduring shift in opinion about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that spent the first 6 years of its life being more unpopular than popular, but that has changed in the last 4 years.
Charles, I want to revisit something that you touched on earlier. We asked whether people thought the president was handling the protests that had occurred since the death of George Floyd, whether he was handling them well or not. Let's talk about the public's approval or disapproval of the protests against police violence toward Black Americans. How do people in Wisconsin feel about those protests? Do they approve of them?
This month on net, they do, by 50% approve, 45% disapprove. 3 weeks ago, it was 46% approve, 49 disapprove. So it's up just a little bit in approval and net approval this month. What we saw was that in June, the initial reaction to the protests was very positive, 61 to 36 approval to disapproval. But that fell over the summer so that by August, before the events in Kenosha happened, that had fallen to 48-48. And it's barely budged in the time since until this month's poll, when we see this modest uptick, but again, a net positive 50 to 45 for the first time since June, when it had been tied or just slightly net negative in between.
And in this poll, did the voters in the state have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Here, the opinion of Black Lives Matter has remained net positive throughout the summer, but it was also, like with the protest, highest in June at 59 to 27, favorable to unfavorable. This month, it's at 47-39. It was 46-40 3 weeks ago, so barely changed over these last 3 weeks.
And let's wrap things up here by talking about some Wisconsin politicians, local politicians elected here representing the state. We'll begin with Tony Evers, the governor of Wisconsin, and his job approval numbers in this poll.
Evers' job approval this month is at 50 approve, 43 disapprove, a net positive 7. But that is a little bit down from 52-42 at the beginning of the month. And it's down considerably from the very high approval levels he had in March and May. In March, right at the beginning of the coronavirus, he hit a record high 65 approve, 29 disapprove. That approval level has worked its way down, ticked up a time or two, but is now at 50 to 43, about where it was in January and February, maybe a shade less positive, less net positive than before the coronavirus hit, but still +7 approval.
The coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic has certainly dominated much of the governor's tenure to date. So how do people think he has handled the response to the coronavirus?
As with his overall job approval, but more so, he got very high marks at the beginning of the outbreak. 76% approved of his initial response, just 17% disapproved back at the end of March. That worked its way down over the summer. And at the beginning of this month, it was 56 approve, 38 disapprove. But now at the end of the month, it's 52 approve, 45 disapprove. Still net positive, but not nearly the large margins that he enjoyed over the summer.
One thing that we noticed in this poll that was different than past polls was how people felt about the state legislature and the job they were doing. There's been a lot written and said, Charles, recently about whether the legislature could be doing more to take on the pandemic. What did we see in the numbers this time? This is a fairly dramatic change since earlier this year.
It is. Now, to be clear, we are asking, do you approve or disapprove of the way the Wisconsin legislature is handling its job? So we're not specifically mentioning coronavirus. And we actually ask this question along with presidential and gubernatorial overall job approval before we start talking about any specific issues. So this is a generalized sense of whether the legislature is doing a good job or a poor job. We started asking this in January of 2019 as we entered an era of divided government between the governor and the legislature to see how they compared. And the legislature has consistently had positive job approvals. Back in January of 19, it was 52 approved, just 31 disapprove. Though unlike the governor or the president, there's a high don't know rate. Back then, 16% said they didn't know or didn't have an opinion about the legislature. In each of the polls we've done through May of this year, which was the last time we asked about the legislature, that approval rating has been net positive. In May, it was 46% approve, 40% disapprove, with 13 undecided. But this month, that's reversed pretty sharply. Approval is down 10 points to 36%, and disapproval is up 10 points to 50% for a net negative 14. And the don't know is the same 13% as before. So it'll be interesting to see if this sustains itself as we're past the election and into next year. But let's not forget, next year, the legislature is back in session and will be called on to deal with a budget and the process of approving that budget. After a number of months with the legislature not in session, this will pose an interesting question of whether people's views of the legislature have sort of permanently shifted here or whether this is just episodic. However, it is worth noting that Evers' approval has declined a bit and his coronavirus approval has declined. And at the same time, we're now seeing the legislature being fairly substantially net negative on job approval, minus 14 for them, plus 7, though, for Evers.
Yeah, good to point out, though, that the job approval rating is a general rating. It's not specific to the COVID issue and how they performed on that, at least for the legislature.
No, that's exactly right. And, again, as we get into the next legislative session, we'll start asking questions about the issues the legislature is specifically dealing with, as well as questions about people's budget preferences. But hey, we've got an election in a week, so the next legislative session seems an eternity off right now.
I lied before we get to the final ratings of some of our local or state politicians. 2 quick questions about the economy and how people view it, how they have viewed this past year and what has happened to the economy, and how they view the next year and whether they are optimistic. Walk us through what we learned about that.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we've seen since the pandemic began. People say the economy is worse off now than it was a year ago, with a whopping 30% margin saying it's worse. 24% say better, 54% say worse. So a net negative 30 points on that. But asked to look ahead, will the economy be better or worse a year from now? People are kind of stunningly positive about that. 45% say it'll be better, just 13% say it'll be worse, for a net difference of 32 points. So what we're seeing there is a good deal of optimism about the future, even as people are quite negative about where we stand today versus 12 months ago.
Yeah, and that's also interesting, Charles. I think one of our last polls talked about how long people think the coronavirus will be with us and when we'll get back to normal. And I think there were maybe as many as 50% thought it might be a year or more. And yet, a lot of people are still optimistic.
I think that's right. And it was 50% said it would be a year or more before things get back to normal. Our unemployment rate has come down over the spring and summer after spiking when we first hit the coronavirus and the economic dislocations of that. So this may reflect some genuinely positive indicators for the future, but it also shows something more important psychologically, that for all the things we've been going through in 2020, people still remain optimistic about the future.
That's a good thing to know. Let's talk about favorable and unfavorable numbers for Tony Evers, which I assume might not be too different than his job approval numbers, but Tony Evers, Tammy Baldwin, and Ron Johnson are 2 U.S. senators.
Yes, favorability usually tracks approval pretty closely, though in Evers' case, it's a little closer, 47% favorable, 43 unfavorable. That's also tapered down a bit over the course of the summer as his overall job approval came down from those spring highs. Tammy Baldwin has been fairly net positive in recent months. This month, 44% favorable, 36 unfavorable, with 19% lacking an opinion about her. She's normally been a bit positive. Right now, though, she's maybe a little bit more net favorable than usual. And for Senator Ron Johnson, 38% favorable, 36 unfavorable, and 26% that lack an opinion about him. And this is a longstanding pattern that Senator Johnson is the senior senator, but he's consistently a little bit less known, 26% not rating him versus 19% for Baldwin. He's been net positive the last couple of polls, but that comes after being net negative for the previous 2 polls. All of them, though, fairly close together.
So to wrap things up, Charles, the takeaway today for you is what? The consistency again of the polling that we've seen in Wisconsin in this last year?
I'd say the most striking thing this year is how little things have changed despite a cacophony of events. We first started asking a matchup between Biden and Trump in August of 2019. And over that whole period, 13 polls now, President Trump has led in 1, and there was a tie in February. But the average of all of them is about a 5-point Biden lead. And since May, every poll has been Biden by 5 plus or minus 1. And that's really remarkable. That is much more stability than we saw in 2016, when we saw some polls with a substantial Clinton lead, others with a near tie. And in the end, we had Clinton up by 6. And of course, President Trump won. I think there are 2 messages to take away for that last point. The first is the polls can be wrong. And while we do everything we can to make them right, in the end, they are what they are. And people should not put an unrealistic level of expectation and certainty on our poll or anyone else's poll for that matter. I think our data show a modest but consistent lead for Biden. But then I'll close with this as we close before each election. Remember, the polls don't vote. It's people that vote. The outcome of the election doesn't depend on what the polls show. The outcome depends on people casting their ballots, having those ballots counted, and controlling American government in the way our Constitution calls for. So get out there and vote if you haven't already. And if you have, thank you.
And for people who want to see all of the results, the crosstabs, everything we have to offer, where do they go?
They go to law.marquette.edu/poll, P-O-L-L. And you'll see the press release there on that page. If you look at the top of the page, there's a little button for results and data. And if you click on that, you'll see the methodology, the survey questionnaire, all of the results and the crosstabs, and have fun.
Charles, thanks for all your good work during this election year and frankly, all the years since 2012 when we first began this project. It's always good to be with you. And And we will continue on even after the election. The Marquette Law School poll is not going away anytime soon. Thanks very much for your time today. And thanks to everybody out there watching and who has been watching over the last few months. We appreciate the interest and the attention. And we'll see you next time on the issues here at Marquette Law School.